As you can see here in the room, as you can see from on your screen back home, this is the most in-person panel, but we have two panelists joining us remotely. So without further ado, I'm very happy to be sitting next to a colleague, a friend, and a donor of the FAST initiative, Simon Triplehorn, representing the Liechtenstein Banking Association as its CEO. We've been working together for the last 10 years on various activities. And I can assure you that the strategic plan of the Liechtenstein Banking Association does not only contain all these language about sustainable finance, it's also lifted up by the association and contributing to the FAST initiative as a donor financially, but even more importantly as sharing expertise with us. And there's a lot of expertise about sustainable finance in the industry here is extremely valuable to us. So thanks also for joining this panel, but in particular for your ongoing support of our work. Simon, all yours for the next 85 minutes.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you for the kind introduction. It's a huge pleasure representing one of the donors from the very beginning to act as a moderator for the next 80-90 minutes, as Daniel already said. We do have an amazing panel with 6 great speakers. We have Fiona Reynolds. She's CEO at UNPRI and chair as well, or she chaired the FAST Financial Sector Commission over the last few years. Then we have Serena Grant. She's head of business engagement at Menderu Foundation's Walk Free. Then we have Christian Leitz at the right end of the table from UBS, and he's a member as well of the Toon Group. Then we have in the middle Alex Thier, CEO at Global Fund to End Modern Slavery, and to my right side Lucia Gysin from Swiss Re, and last but not least, and he joins us remotely as well, like Fiona and Serena, Dr. Luis Fabiano de Assis. He's professor at Stanford University. Each of the panelists, of the speakers, has prepared a short speech of around 10 minutes. After each speech, I have planned to make a short Q&A session, and hopefully, and you're invited to actively participate in these Q&A sessions. In the end, and I very much hope that we have time to do so, I plan to discuss some takeaways of today's session, as it is the purpose of today's event, not just to reflect what has been achieved over the last few years and the lessons learned, but as well what could be done in the future and how the FAST initiative can contribute to fight or to end modern slavery. I envisage as well to discuss, let's say, not a work plan, but how the FAST initiative can contribute in the future. So, by having said that, I'd like to hand over to Fiona. I think everyone in the room and who's joining us virtually knows her very well, but Fiona, may I ask you to briefly introduce yourself before you start? And with that, I'd like to hand over to Fiona. Thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you. And I'm sorry I can't be there in person. We're actually running our own annual PRI conference this week in London. So I wasn't able to travel. maybe I hope another time to see you all live in person. So I'm Fiona Reynolds. I'm the CEO of the Principles for Responsible Investment. So the PRI is a UN supported organisation. It was created in 2006. Really, it was created to bring sustainability issues into capital markets, and we focus on how to integrate environmental, social and governance factors into the investment process. We now have, when we launched, we had 86 signatories to our 6 principles, but now some time later, we have over 4,000 signatories to our 6 principles who collectively represent 120 trillion US in assets under management, which is more than half of the world's institutionally managed money. So I think, coming back to the topic, that it's fair to say that over the last decade, investors' understanding of in both environmental and governance indicators, or the E and the G in ESG, and their materiality has significantly improved. And investors have moved to integrate those indicators into risk analysis and into screening. However, I do think it's also fair to say that social performance considerations have often been dismissed as either immaterial or of a lesser priority. And this is because of the perception that they present a lower risk to revenue streams or are less likely to be subject to regulatory action or to punitive measures. And perhaps because some treat some of the issues as a bit out of sight, out of mind, and this includes the issues of modern slavery and human trafficking. As we know, many social issues are in the developing world, and really we've allowed problems to be outsourced down a supply chain, and not everybody, not all businesses, not all investors take responsibility for them. Also, I think because investors are one step further removed from the actual outcomes for people associated with their investments, they can sometimes pay less attention. And due to the semi-qualitative nature of many social issues, for some investors, they find it harder to reconcile this with the more really quantitative approach of modern finance. So when it comes to social issues or human rights issues, investors often cite the lack of data as really a key barrier. They say that it's too difficult to know how and where to start assessing social performance, and that the S indicators are too hard to measure, partly because there isn't reliable and comparable data. And while of course it's true that social issues can be more complex than other issues, in so much as they don't have like a single indicator like climate, you might have an emissions reduction target that's easier to understand and it's easier to measure. This shouldn't stop investors, in my view, or be an excuse to action. We can't really let the perfect be the enemy of the good. That doesn't mean we don't need to work on the data issues. And we really have to get to a point where we care just as much about people as we do about the planet, with our focus on climate. Investors are very focused.
Maybe let's try to solve, there seems to be a technical issue. 1 second, please. Still doesn't work. Sorry. Okay, the colleagues just said you're muted on your side. Seems not to be the case. She's off. Yeah. Maybe she tries to log in again. Yeah. Yeah, let's wait quickly. Sorry for the interruption.
Okay, I'm hoping that I'm back and you can hear me.
We can hear you. Perfect.
Great.
Please go
The,
ahead. Sorry.
the joys of technology. When it works, it's good, and when it doesn't, it's not so good. So I'm not sure what happened there. So I apologise for that. So I was talking about the fact that the the perception of a lower risk around social issues also really needs to be challenged. So social issues can and do create key risks for investors. They're salient and they are only becoming increasingly evident, as we've seen through COVID-19, through social unrest, through issues about equality and diversity, through the Black Lives Matter protests and the Women's March. The prevailing investor application of materiality is also far too narrow, and this is an issue that we've been working on at the PRI. It's really stemming from its historical roots in the legal concept, and it gives rise to short-term and static views of financial materiality. However, it really disregards the much improved understanding of risks we have today, arising from secular trends such as climate change, technological advance, and changes in demography, which change the operational backdrop from companies. And so these risks are fluid as they change in nature and intensity over time. And they also create pressure for regulatory change, making ESG issues, including the social dimensions, crucial for risk management. So one of the things that we've been doing as a result of looking at social issues within the PRI is we've looked at the legal definitions around fiduciary duty. And we've done this over a number of years, and we've just done an updated piece of work with the law firm Freshfields and with our sister organisation UNFFI and with Generation Foundation. And we're really looking at the whole issue of sustainability within the legal definitions and within regulation. And we've just put out a new paper, and we've got 15 countries that over the next year or so that we're going to focus on changing regulations to make it very clear that investors need to be really prioritising and looking at sustainability issues in more detail. And we think that this piece of work is going to help people focus on sustainability outcomes while at the same time looking at their financial returns. I think in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic, people are finally waking up really to the interconnectedness of issues and understanding that without healthy people and a healthy planet, you're not going to have a healthy economy or you're not going to have healthy profit within your companies. So for some people, COVID-19 has served as really a first proof point for sustainability, and specifically around social issues. It's really demonstrated just how material issues such as workers' rights, access to healthcare, social safety nets, really being on top of your supply chains are to business. And in addition to growing expectations around responsible business conduct, there are increasing regulations and legislations, of course, around human rights and labour rights that are relevant to both companies and investors. So human rights issues also continue to be on top of the agenda when it comes to the just transition around climate change. But as a direct result, really, of some of the work that we've done with FAST, and thinking about how we can best operate within the investment community and how we can incorporate social issues, including modern slavery and human trafficking, we at the PRI have developed, and we launched it this year, a five-year human rights program. We started it with a paper that we launched last year, and our aim is really to get this space moving and develop so that investors include human rights in their investment process. So we've tried to make it really clear that any responsible investor should build their approach to include the S issues in ESG on respect for human rights. So our work is going to be underpinned by the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD Guidelines. And looking at the investment industry, the UNGPs have been used by investors in engagements with companies and to inform their responsible investment practice more broadly. For PRI signatories, however, this has more been a voluntary exercise, and we only really see a minority of leading investors participating or reporting on human rights. So about 42% of PRI signatories mention human rights in their reporting to us, but less than 10% use the UNGPs or the OECD guidelines in screening their portfolios. And in terms of collaborative engagement, so engaging with companies in a collective way, with engagements that are run by PRI, we've only had, out of those 4,300 signatories that I was just talking about, we've only had 115 investors over the past 5 years. So less than 5% of our signatory base. If we compare that to climate action, for example, there's thousands of signatories involved. So informed by the UNGPs and the OECD guidelines for multinationals, we've clarified that institutional investors have a three-part responsibility to respect human rights. So in their policy commitments, in their due diligence process, and in their enabling or providing access to remedy. And following the release of our human rights position paper, we've set out a multi-year agenda. So the agenda has 5 core priority areas. So one's investment practices, so whereby we're looking to align investment practices and activities with the UNGPs across different types of investment strategies and asset classes. And we're developing a whole lot of case studies and guidance for signatories. We're also working across public policy, so we support the creation of a level playing field through mandatory due diligence legislation and accountability mechanisms. I think the EU is currently leading the way, but we need to see that roll out in more countries and have better alignment. And companies and investors both playing a more important role in giving policy makers the confidence to act and saying that we support the work about mandatory human rights due diligence. I mentioned data a number of times, so we really recognise the need to define appropriate approaches and metrics to capture when companies are responding to preventing harm to people, and to move beyond policy and process and capture real outcomes for people. So we're working about how we improve social data with a number of organisations. We're working on investor reporting. So we must ensure accountability in the investment industry. So to this end, at the PRI, we're working with our signatories, and we're going to introduce very specific human rights reporting over the coming years into our reporting framework. So everyone who's a PRI signatory must report on an annual basis about their activities. If you don't report, you are delisted as a signatory. And then finally, in stewardship, so in engagement with companies, we need to place the guiding principles at the heart of conversations between investors and companies to drive more forward thinking and preventative action. So we're at the moment setting up a platform for a collective investor engagement on human rights that we plan to launch next year, and it will be a multi-year engagement. So we're working with our signatories and with key partners, and that will include FAST, to deliver on our work program. I'm really confident that our work, while it won't happen overnight, will lead to long-term change. So we're all about not about flash in the pan issues. We're all about how do you bring about long-term change within the investment sector. So we believe that our 5-year program will deeply embed human rights into the investment chain. My aim is that we see in the next 5 years, investors treat human rights in the same way that they now treat climate, in that they might be at different stages, but there isn't any of our signatories who aren't thinking about climate, and we've got some leading signatories who are really leading the way on emissions reductions and net zero pledges. So we want to see everyone acting and moving in the right direction. So we really, I think the FAST initiative's been really important. It's been important to informing our work and to thinking about the best way that our signatories can really be incorporating issues such as modern slavery and human trafficking, but it needs to be underpinned by having a big focus on all human rights, and that's what we're doing. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Fiona, for your input statement and for your insights, what you're doing at PRI. Are there any reactions from the audience or even from the other panelists to what you have just heard from Fiona? Any questions?
Maybe just one comment, and I think we should come back to that in the discussion, because when I looked at the goals, there was a reference, and Fiona quite rightly made that reference to climate and the TCFD, and I think it is on the one hand a good reference, on the other hand it's a rather tricky one. So I think we should come back to that, because at the end TCFD is about one KPI, and that's CO2, full stop. You can talk about methane or whatever, but at the end it's CO2. You know, we would talk about human rights, wow. You know, and so that one we should really come back to. I think as far as the framework's concerned, I completely understand that's highlighted. You know, we need governance, strategy, risk management, metrics and targets, and we should apply TCFD to everything in the framework. I think my last comment on TCFD, and also something to come back to, because I've used that in the last few weeks so often, is to remind people of Mark Carney's speech in 2015 that started the whole process. And Mark was only talking about the outside-in view. He was just talking about financial risk. That's the basis, you know, of the whole discussion around climate. So, of course, that's also to be remembered when we're now looking a lot more at the inside-out view, you know, which is the risk that a company can create for the environment and or society. And I think there are sort of a few kind of caveats to that discussion, which I think we should come back to.
Well, thank you. I suggest that we come back and maybe at the end of the discussion when we have gone through all the presentations. Any other question from the audience? Otherwise, I suggest that we go to the next presentation. Serena, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and hello everyone. Very pleased to be joining you here today from Perth in Western Australia, and really pleased to have partnered with FAST over the last year, or almost 2 years now. So I guess I'll start with a brief introduction about Walk Free. For those who don't know us as an organisation, we're an international human rights organisation that focuses on ending all forms of modern slavery. Back when FAST launched the blueprint, we entered into a partnership, and it was fairly loose at the time. We decided we wanted to partner with FAST to implement the blueprint in the Asia Pacific region, and we were really interested in how we might do that and the different stakeholders that we might engage with. And I'm pleased to say that has turned into 2 quite significant projects that I think will have real impact both in the region and globally. And I think that they fit very well into this session, because one is particularly focused on knowing and showing risks, particularly risks relating to human rights and modern slavery, and the other is around using leverage creatively. So the first one that I referenced there was our work with stock exchanges to really improve the way listed companies report on modern slavery risks and what they disclose. And then the second initiative that we've launched together with FAST is around investor engagement. So we've developed and launched a coalition of investors who are now actively engaging companies on modern slavery risks. I'll go into a bit more detail about each of those, starting with the stock exchange project. I think our ambition there was really to improve the standards and guidance for listed companies in terms of how they're identifying risks and the particular risks that they may see in that market. And then secondly, how and what they are disclosing to investors and other stakeholders. So this has begun with a partnership with the Stock Exchange of Thailand, which I think is quite interesting in itself as a fairly high risk country with a lot of issues in terms of labour risks and exploitation. And we've developed guidance which we will co-publish with the stock exchange. And this guidance essentially sets out what companies should do to identify modern slavery risks, both in their operations and throughout their supply chains and broader value chains. And it also has a checklist which sets out that process for knowing and showing, or identifying and addressing risks, as well as what they should be disclosing to the market. It's quite interesting in that we've targeted the risk assessment piece in a fairly detailed way. It's focused on specific risks in Thailand for Thai companies, and it goes a level further, looking at the 8 different sectors that are listed on the Thai Stock Exchange. So we've broken it down to do a bit of a snapshot of the particular risks that are relevant to each sector in Thailand. So we're really excited to publish that guidance. We've worked on it in partnership with FAST, and we're planning to launch it towards the end of this year with a launch event in December. And we're hoping that we can use that as a model with other stock exchanges. So I think, you know, really to Fiona's point before around, you know, we need stronger metrics, we need KPIs here. I think that that's really where we need to start the conversation, whether that's with legislation, mandatory human rights due diligence legislation, or modern slavery acts, or stock exchange disclosure requirements. I think we need to start having those conversations and setting out what we want those metrics to be now. I think the points that were made as well around investors being able to act on the information and having quantifiable information are very good points. And I see a lot of our work as doing quite a tricky dance in terms of translating the UN guiding principles on business human rights into something that is very practical for companies, but also where we're encouraging them to disclose things that are, I guess, measurable or quantifiable and can be acted on by investors and other stakeholders. So I'll move on now to talk a little bit about the second project, which we again are working on in collaboration with FAST, and that's Investors Against Slavery and Trafficking, which is an investor-led initiative which we have co-designed and launched. Walk Free and FAST act as both the secretariat and knowledge partner for this investor coalition. And we now have close to 35 investors, some of the largest institutional investors across Asia, and 7.8 trillion in assets under management, which while it pales in comparison to the impressive PRI numbers that Fiona was just mentioning, we're really pleased that there has been such enthusiasm for the initiative across Asia. And in less than a year since launching, we've really seen investors taking the lead on this and wanting to learn more about how they can actively engage companies on these issues. So the initiative launched last year. It began with 2 key work streams. The first one was around really setting expectations on what investors wanted companies to do. So they sent a investor expectations letter to the top 200 listed companies in Australia, and they followed up with engagement with a number of those. And then the second work stream has focused on much deeper engagement. So the investors selected about 25 companies from across their portfolios around Asia, and they've set out detailed engagement plans with goals for those companies to reach over the course of the engagement. So we've just finalised those plans, and maybe about half have actively begun those engagements with the companies, and we're working with the investors again to focus on, okay, what do the reporting mechanisms look like? What are the metrics going to look like as this initiative develops? So I think, that's really complementary to a lot of the work that PRI is doing and that FAST is doing around developing the S indicators and metrics. And, we'd love to continue collaborating on that aspect of things as the initiative grows across Asia. The other piece that I'll mention there, which I think is also interesting, is the advocacy opportunities that we've started to identify with this group of investors. And I think that's a really key role for them as stakeholders, to really look for opportunities where laws or policy can strengthen the regulatory or reporting environment for companies, and to support ways to strengthen those policies and laws. And that's I guess a third work stream that we've started working with them on, is looking at how, as knowledge partners, Walk Free and FAST can share information on sort of key risks and opportunities to support calls for action, but also to make submissions, you know, where there's a legislative consultation process or other opportunities for them to throw their weight behind key changes to these laws and policies that are needed. So I think looking ahead, you know, we're quite keen to grow both of these initiatives. On the investor side, you know, I think in particular we're focused on growing that network of investors across Asia, and also increasing the number of focus companies that are Asia based. And that's also recognising that, you know, our experience of these engagements has been that, you know, a lot of companies that are in jurisdictions that do have modern slavery acts or due diligence requirements do have fairly decent processes in place in terms of identifying and addressing modern slavery risks, but that there's a lot of jurisdictions out there that don't have similar requirements, and there really is a huge gap between those companies and the ones that are required to report. So, you know, we'd like to expand that focus across Asia more, and also grow the number of investors in the initiative. Similarly, on the stock exchange side of things, you know, we're really interested in engaging some of the most influential exchanges in the world. So following the launch of the Thai guidance, we'd like to work to engage, for example, the London Stock Exchange, New York, Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan, and others. And we've started having conversations with some of those exchanges already in terms of where they are in ESG reporting requirements generally, and then more specifically on human rights and on modern slavery. So that's I guess a snapshot of the work we've been doing in partnership with FAST over the last year or so, and we've been really pleased with the progress on both fronts. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for growth with those two initiatives. I'll pause there and just see if there's any feedback or questions.
Thank you so much, Serena. Maybe one question from my side, which came to my mind during your speech. Obviously, and that has been mentioned as well by Fiona, quantitative information plays a crucial role. How can we measure and how can we improve high quality data? And is there let's say a cooperation between PRI and what you are doing at PRI, and on the other hand, Serena, what you're doing with investor engagement, and what you're doing with the project at the Thailand Stock Exchange? Is there a kind of a coordination or a kind of cooperation to improve high quality data?
No, I think we could do a lot more. So Fiona, I'd love to chat after the event to talk a bit more about the work that you've been doing. You know, I think Fiona's been kind of across some of these projects through FAST and through the collaborations, and also FAST and Walk Free have participated in a number of PRI consultations. They recently ran one on human rights, which we provided input to. So I think, you know, we're probably broadly across what each other is doing, but it would be great to learn more and to see how that has progressed. And, you know, I will say, I think one of the key things here is the engagement that we're doing with investors is loosely modelled off the Find It, Fix It, Prevent It initiative in the UK, which really operates on the basis that, you know, modern slavery impacts every supply chain in the world. So it really should be about finding it first and then fixing it and preventing it. And I think when you translate that into metrics, we can't answer all the metrics questions right now, but I really do think a key metric that we should all be focusing on is how many incidents of modern slavery or related exploitation are you seeing and reporting, and watching that number grow. And it seems like it seems counterintuitive to say, oh, a company that's reporting a large number of incidents is doing really well. But I think that's the message we need to promote, that this really is about transparency. It is about finding it. And if you're not finding it, you're probably not looking. So I think that those are conversations we need to continue to have. And yes, I'd love to talk more with Fiona about PRI's work on that front.
Well, perfect. Maybe that's a role for FAST as well, and for a FAST Secretariat to play. A second question as well with regards to information and the availability of data. What do you expect in Europe at the moment? The so-called social taxonomy is currently on the way. What do you expect in terms of improved information available as a result of the social taxonomy? Is there an expectation or?
An expectation? I think there's a hope. There's a hope. And I have to say, one of my colleagues in London has been involved with the consultation on the social taxonomy. And, I'm hopeful that we can get to a place where we do have more uniform and consistent measurements that we can use on various human rights issues, including modern slavery. I have to say, I'm not across the detail of the social taxonomy. And yeah, I'd probably say Fiona's best place to answer.
Yeah, I just jump in there, Serena, and just in terms of the social taxonomy. So the Chief Responsible Investment Officer at the PRI, who reports to me, is the chair of the sustainable finance work that's happening through the EU Commission. So and then they're obviously working on the social taxonomy at the moment, so that, well, he's chairing it as the PRI, and a number of our staff are feeding into it. So we're very connected and connecting our work with the social taxonomy. I mean, obviously there's a lot of layers to go through, and then it has to get through the commission and all of those sorts of things. But but the investment community is very much involved, which is great.
That's true. Yeah, thank you. Maybe let's go on, because Christian Leitz, he touched upon two very important things just before, and I'm sure you will say as well a few words on the data and availability of the data. And well, let's go on. The floor is yours, Christian.
Okay. Thanks to FAST for inviting me. And actually, as a historian by trade, it's kind of nice to be invited into a room, that is so historical. At least I feel like I'm surrounded by history here. I'm actually the UBS's historian, so I do look at things in pretty much historical terms, alongside everything else. But I come to this topic from kind of three angles that I work on. And the first one is stakeholder engagement and management. The second one is disclosure. So my team and I will look after the sustainability report, climate report, modern slavery statement, and human rights statement of our bank. And partnership, which is the Thun Group of banks, the first industry initiative that actually translated the UNGPs into a particular industry. Because I remember UNGPs are not written for a particular industry. There is no financial sector language anywhere in that. John, and sadly missed. I remember the discussions we had in Geneva. I think he spent one day, the team, with the financial sector, about 65 days with the mining industry, which is not surprising, when the UNGPs were developed. So the financial sector was definitely at the back of the whole discussion around the UNGP. So it was actually interesting that banks were the first ones to translate the whole thing into what it means for a bank. So that's the third piece. And maybe a fourth piece, I also work for our board of directors, so there's a bit of a governance angle here. Historically, when I go back, I've been with UBS now for 18 years, and I got this interesting task at the end of 2003 to develop the whole engagement process with non-governmental organizations. And my very first conversation, which I think is quite apt to this discussion, was with a Swiss NGO on the topic of human rights. And I found it very interesting because I had worked on Nazi Germany, Franco Spain as a historian, I've written books about them and so on. And I realized in the conversation we had never, ever, ever, in any of the books, any of the teachings, any of the research, used the word human rights. Which is kind of interesting, moving from one work to another, So I thought ever since, language is an interesting one, and I still find that a very interesting one today, actually on the topic of human rights, and that's something worth a discussion later on, because that's another contrast to the climate topic. When I talk to people, people never, ever, ever use the word human rights in the context of business opportunities. Never. Then they say health, education, employment. They don't, water, whatever, right to education. They don't say human rights, which they would never do on the topic of climate, They would use it exactly in the same manner on the two. So language is for me an interesting one, in terms of the discussions we're having, because I think quite often what we're actually talking about is, do people understand the same thing, when we talk about something? Because we always tend to assume they do, but maybe they don't, And I think on climate, that tends to be a lot easier, I find, because I think there are a lot more conversations. So just some thoughts about the discussion later on. And I looked at this from the sort of knowing and showing perspective, And so I had this conversation, we had these first discussions with NGOs, and then I thought, okay, well, that's not a very organized fashion, You can get information from one NGO, and then you collect it from another one. It's pretty of a time-consuming effort, So I initiated the building of a tool, which I think is tools and methodologies are critical to all of that. And I initiated the building of a tool, which a small Swiss company built in 2004, five for us. It's called RepRisk. It's now the largest tool in the world, capturing anything around environmental and social issues. And that was a very interesting one because it sort of gave you a sense, okay, how are these topics popping up all around the place? And actually, interesting, one of my closest allies in this, a good colleague at Credit Suisse, has now actually moved, so things come full circle, to that very company, and is now working for them, having moved from Credit Suisse to there. So what UBS has done, and I think that's the interesting or the important next step, and I think from what I know, we're still the only bank in the world that has done that, is actually use a tool like that to feed it directly into our compliance tool. And I think that's a very critical step that we took about 7 years ago. Because what it means, and this is important about knowing, what it means is that when you go at the front as a client advisor, as somebody who's looking at a particular transaction, when you go and put in your usual check in your compliance tool, which you would do, around anti-money laundering, is it a terrorist, whatever, the usual stuff, the same information would come up, or call it red flag, whatever you want to call it, for whether there is some allegation around environmental pollution, human rights violations, etc. So it creates the same mechanism. And of course, what that means on the one hand is, of course, it just raises automatically the whole attention to the topic. We can talk a lot about training and educating people. That's an important part, but it's pretty arduous, having to train. I mean, we are kind of 70,000 people at our firm. Of course, there's a fifth, probably IT, so you don't have to train everybody in the topics, but still, that's a lot of effort. So if you can automatize certain things, and in that sense, raise the awareness very directly, because if that red flag comes up, you have to stop. You have to be the first line of defense, which you are, So risk being the second line of defense, audit being the third line of defense. You have to be that first line of defense and say, okay, what am I going to do with this? And actually, it has an interesting, which tends to come up with in NGO conversations, over and over again. When they ask, are you actually stopping things, transactions? I say, well, in the statistics that we publish in our sustainability report, you wouldn't find that, because what you would only find is if it goes to the second line of defense. If the first line of defense doesn't actually even start the transaction because they feel, that's a tricky one, then that's already gone. So I think there are interesting elements that come out of that kind of process that you create. The other one, which is really critical, of course, and I think it's often underestimated, is, of course, it creates that partnership inside the firm, and actually it creates the partnership between compliance and risk. Because at the end of the day, financial crime prevention and environmental and social risk, or it's today called sustainability risk, are in two different parts of banks usually. I mean, one is a risk management function. Climate risk is today an established category in our risk category, sitting alongside operational risk, market risk, capital risk, and so on. But that's risk management. That's chief risk officer. Financial crime prevention sits with compliance. And of course, also the mindset tends to be more of a compliance one, whereas the environment and social risk people often deal with, allegations. They don't deal necessarily with, legal evidence. Yes, we know that's a terrorist. Well, it doesn't work like that, particularly with the human rights topic. It's a bit tricky. So I think it's important, that there is, out of all of that, alongside the kind of the knowing on the basis of what kind of tools, data, and when I say data, it's got to be quantitative and qualitative. Not everything is quantitative, and that's why ESG, when you look at the G, a lot of the G is qualitative. And it's the most, I always found governance rather dull, but actually I've become, now convinced that the whole thing should really be called GES and not ESG, because if you don't get your governance right, forget about ENS, it doesn't work. So you've got to be clear on, how is the firm run, how is your management done, what's senior management buy-in into the topics, what are the processes, policies, all the things that sound pretty dull to people are the most critical piece to the whole story. So the G. But the G is often very qualitative. It's not necessarily numbers. It's about, okay, is there a body in your board of directors that looks after that? That's a G. What's your risk management process? What kind of framework do you have? How do you disclose about your policies and processes? So I think there is a lot around knowing which goes beyond just thinking around, okay, how do we get to the KPI? There's a lot more to it. And so it's quality and quantity around this kind of knowing process. Now, on the sort of partnerships, so we've been, as I said, working within the Thun Group, which is actually named after our conference center. So, we very cleverly stole that from the Wolfsberg Group, which of course, is also a UBS conference center. So, a bit of branding for us, although nobody knows that. And people have problems pronouncing Thun. Wolfsberg is a bit easier to pronounce, But they're both UBS conference centers in Switzerland, so we did a bit of branding. It's actually interesting, the very first speech that we had at the very first event of Thun Group in 2011 was by Jemai Olfi, who was then still at UBS and was one of the key figures, in the whole process that led that, in the whole Wolfsberg Group. So what she actually did is explain how that partnership approach that they've been doing around anti-money laundering, how could that be used as a model when you look at the human rights topic from a risk management perspective, which is what a lot of the people, from the banks actually come from. But so, public-private partnership is a critical piece in improving the knowing, So the work that is being done by our colleagues, in financial crime prevention, either directly or via the Wolfsberg Group with such bodies as the Joint Money Laundering Task Force, called, what a long name, Operational Group in the UK, and other such bodies, So I think, let's be clear, a lot of the data, as we know, and that's probably also a bit of a difference to the climate topic, A lot of the data sits with governments, doesn't sit with companies. I think with climate, that seems to be more, with the companies that need to create that kind of, which is why the Federal Council of Switzerland has now very wisely decided that the economy as a whole needs to provide, climate-related data, not just the financial sector, because at the end, the whole thing only works if there are reliable data coming from companies. But I think on this discussion, in the broader human rights area, it's a bit more difficult. And of course, there are other such initiatives like the European Bankers Alliance, et cetera, that work and try to improve, the collaboration, and remember, there are some caveats to that too, and I always have to throw these in because it's just something that I experience every day. Competition law, and let's not forget that one, is an interesting one, So there are things that people need to deal with when they do these kind of partnerships, but still there are things that are possible. That's why these developments show. So really try to improve the knowing through a whole way of different channels. Now on the showing, of course, the disclosures, that's why I mentioned that, and clearly this is, when you look at another tool that I initiated about 7 years ago called, Policy Outlook, which was really to look at what's happening in the regulatory space. And unbelievable, you know. I mean, in the first year, I sort of, there's a red flag system in that tool, you know, and I followed that, you know. I mean, there were 100 developments, you know. Today, I can't follow this anymore, you know. It's just ridiculous, you know, what's happening around the world. Actually, I say ridiculous because we should really not say taxonomy. We have to say taxonomies, you know, because there are about 16 or 17 under development. Yes, you know, sitting here, people look at the EU more than anything else. But there is Canada, and they're definitely not going to follow the EU. There's Australia, which is definitely not going to follow the EU. There's Japan, which is definitely not going to follow the EU. And there's Russia, which, whatever, you know, and there's China, you know. So this is not, there's not just one, just on that, you know, notion of taxonomies. But the showing is, of course, you know, why I mentioned policy outlook, because the number one topic of all the topics in terms of regulatory developments, you know, and there's been a massive increase in 2020 is transparency, before anything else. You know, before climate, before whatever. Climate is actually, I think, third or fourth. You know, transparency is number one. Because what are modern slavery acts? They're around transparency. What is TCFD? It's even got the D in there, which is disclosure. You know? So at the end, it's really about that. Now, the problem, as I said, is, you know, I think one finds it a lot easier to do that showing around climate, you know, than about human rights, because climate seems to be less complex, or at least there is more effort that is being put into the topic, you know, which actually is also a challenge at the moment, because everybody is focused on climate, you know. I mean, 10 years ago, honestly, in my job, nobody used the word climate. You still heard the word environment, you know? And a lot about human rights. But now, I mean, climate is like big letters and it's everywhere, which is a challenge in itself in terms of where is the first priority for companies today in terms of showing it's climate. You know? It's not an excuse, it's just the reality that we are faced with. And so I think what we do around the showing, which I think is very critical, is you really need to be able to explain, to my earlier point, your policies, your processes, and so on. You know? If you have a situation where it's not necessarily about a KPI-rich environment, you should at least do a good job to use the TCFD framework around governance, strategy, risk management. And you have to see how you can improve on metrics and targets, you know. But clearly the first three, I mean, that's the minimum of what you should do around showing. So actually, for instance, we built our human rights statement exactly on the same structure. Yeah. And so we do talk about the kinds of points that Fiona highlighted. You know, what does our asset management do in this space, which is critical, you know. So actually also one important thing is do look at the business model, you know. I mean, not every bank, I don't like the word bank, because at the end it's the business model that's critical to the discussion, which is why Fiona, of course, you know, when you talk about PRI, if there is no asset management in the bank that you're in, you know, then of course you wouldn't have that discussion, you know. We do, because we do have an asset management. So I think that's, on the showing, this is, to me, a critical piece. Let's not get too hung up around KPI. Let's also think about the really important qualitative stuff that should be highlighted, and that should be brought out, and that should be explained in the way that we're handling that. And actually, I mean, I think when I look at showing, one of the discussions that I, of course, constantly have with NGOs is around, okay, tell us what you did about particular company X or particular client Y. And then I say, you know, Switzerland does have client confidentiality rules, you know. We can't even say if we didn't do the transaction, which is a pretty difficult thing for some people to accept, but it's just the reality of it. So there are things, and actually it's in the OECD RBC paper, you know, on, what is it, securities and lending, securities underwriting and lending. There's exactly a piece on that challenge in there. So I think these kind of elements should also not be forgotten, particularly now when we're moving in an environment where I think, as we all know, litigation is just going to go increase around the ESG topic. So maybe I'll leave it here. I know I have a few comments around, you know, using leverage, but I think knowing and showing, to me, at this point, are sort of the critical pieces.
Thank you, Christian. Very tangible, very concrete, and very practical. One question from my side. You mentioned the qualitative stuff or factors. Do you see there a role to play for the FAST initiative when it comes to the qualitative stuff or the qualitative factors?
Absolutely. I mean, I think at the end, which is why when I looked at, I can't remember where it was under goal 2 or 3, TCFD was explicitly mentioned. But if you dig further down into TCFD, there are clear recommendations about what it actually means when you talk about governance around climate. And I think, that's what I'm saying, one should really think about that, and how can that be a model as a kind of a guidance, is to say, okay, what does it mean? Okay, board of directors, senior management, what kind of bodies do you have? Do you train and educate your senior management? And I think that's exactly what the TCFD model does, and that's why I think it can be translated into any topic that deals with E or S. And I think that could be a role to play. Okay, what would be precisely along those lines? What would be the expectations? And I think that the challenge, or the interesting, let's put it neutrally, the interesting discussion will be around the fourth pillar of the TCFD, which is metrics and targets. Not so much targets. I think one can think about targets, but metrics is an interesting one. But of course, that's what the previous two speakers refer to exactly, is to try, kind of improve that over time.
Any other question? Yes, please.
Issues of compliance, and that very much equates with my conclusions of having corresponded with quite a lot of the banks, I think including your own, the sense in which the risk of slavery does not seem to be integrated in all the kind of banking processes. Do you think that unless that structural issue is addressed, that we won't really make progress about taking modern slavery risks seriously as material risks to business?
Actually, I think they are integrated, and that was my point about language. It's just people don't necessarily use the word modern slavery. And I think this also, it's very telling when you think about the regulatory landscape, that there are countries, well, I don't know what happened in the Netherlands, but there used to be this idea around the child labor, a law against child labor. There's the Loi de Vigilance, there is the Modern Slavery Act. In Switzerland, there is another version of it around the counter-proposal to the Responsible Business Initiative. So I think the reality is that people generally, that's my experience, subsume it under the human rights topic. And they're much more likely to talk about forced labor, indigenous people's rights, child labor, and so on, than use necessarily the language of modern slavery and human trafficking. But at the end of the day, they're talking about the same thing. So sometimes I think it's more that than anything else, because when I look at our processes, and I can in that case only speak for our bank, it is clearly integrated. I mean, it's happening in compliance, it's happening at risk. They're looking at those risks around modern slavery and human trafficking, but you probably won't see it as explicit. Well, you will see it most explicitly, of course, in the Modern Slavery Act statement, which is why that's the critical piece in terms of the showing or the disclosures. But in terms of the internal, I mean, I still remember conversations where people said to me, human rights, that's what happens in Rwanda or Yugoslavia, what has that got to do with, I mean, this is not that long ago. So I think getting people acquainted with language and what it means and how to then embed that into the processes should not be underestimated. It doesn't mean it's not happening, but people may use a different term and they talk about exactly the same.
Yes, please. Any other question?
Yes, good morning, and thank you very much also for your question about human rights. Actually, I was wondering whether you are also referring not only to ILO, International Labour Organization, various treaties, but also to special rapporteurs at the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And there are two very interesting special rapporteurs. One is Professor Obokata from Japan. He teaches in the UK. And the other one is, and he is dealing with modern slavery. And the other one is a lady, Professor Mulali. She teaches in Ireland, and she deals with human trafficking. And both have published very interesting reports. You can find them on the website of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So I think indeed there is a missing link, and I think it could be interesting, or I could provide you actually with some information about this, but there is a missing link in this regard. Actually, you have to know that on Monday in Geneva, there is a forum on business and human rights. And so that's why I think it will be good, again, to make links. And I'm very happy about your intervention. Thank you.
I think you also, yeah, absolutely, and we've had these conversations and interactions with commissioners on the topic. But I think one thing which is absolutely critical, why you mentioned the ILO, and we use the ILO standards when it comes to child labor, indigenous people's rights, forced labor. And actually that's a very important point in terms of the similar thinking as with the automation, which is you have to have standards that are internationally recognized. So regardless of whether your employee sits in Japan or the US, whatever spectrum of Australia, Europe, it doesn't matter, you have to say, okay, this is universally applicable, So UNESCO World Heritage Sites, Ramsar, RSPO, ILO, and that's been a very important process because people will say, well, but that only applies, but that's my point about taxonomies, which is why that's going to be an interesting challenge, But that only applies to those that are exposed to the EU jurisdiction. It doesn't apply to me, And so for us, it was for our colleagues that developed our environmental social risk framework, it was very critical to have standards which apply across the board, regardless of where you are in the world. It's not an easy undertaking, but at least, it does work, Which is why, of course, there is that focus on the ILO standards in particular around those topics.
Christian, I very much regret to interrupt because your intervention was, as I said, very practical.
Questions for me.
In fact, I do have a lot of questions myself, but to save time, we have 3 further interventions, and please, Alex, you're the next one.
Thank you.
Please,
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I want to start again by thanking our hosts. Liechtenstein and the FAST initiative, in these times, it's just short of heroic to pull off a conference successfully, and I think we've all found that. I was thinking about the name of FAST, which in English, of course, can mean 2 things. It either means that you go quickly or you don't eat. Clearly, I was gratified to find that it was the former and not the latter that is the emphasis of this conference, because I think that the great thing about this discussion yesterday and today has been to hear about so many things that so many are doing, and this convening is, I think, helping us all learn and get better at collaborating. I always want to be on the team that is both thinking great thoughts and getting things done, and I think you've demonstrated that's what the FAST initiative is about, so we're proud to be part of this team. I just want to tell 3 brief stories in my time. One about the past, one about the present, and one about the future. The past is that about 9 years ago, a group of people got together to talk about what should be done to combat modern slavery, which at that time the world was realizing with the first global estimates was an enormous problem. Since then, we've only realized that the problem has grown, not shrunk. But one of the ideas that came out of that convening was to create a global fund to end modern slavery. And the reasons for that was that the level of resources, the level of commitment, the level of collaboration to deal with this enormous challenge simply were not sufficient. And so I'm happy to say that a creative group and generous group of people came together, and after a struggle in 2017, the Global Fund was born. In that time, because of the generosity of the US Congress, of the UK government, of the Liechtenstein government, of the Norwegian government, and several other private foundations and companies, we've been able to open our doors. We're working in 9 countries on a wide variety of issues that are addressing the challenges of modern slavery. And in this 4 years, I think we've been able to demonstrate a proof of concept. And that is that we can do this work in a way that when we work together collaboratively, when we focus on systemic change and not just individual programs, that we can actually make an outsized impact. But I still have to say that unfortunately some of that conversation has not gone away. If anything, the scale of the challenge has grown. As some discussed yesterday, we know that the global estimate numbers this year of child labor, next year of global slavery, are going to go up. Spoiler alert, we are not going to end modern slavery by 2030. The numbers are going in the wrong direction, and that is despite the fact that there are more resources and more partnerships and more collaboration going into it than before. And I think that some of this is due to the fact that we simply do not have the scale of effort that is needed to address these challenges. If you look, for example, at the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, there are 26 million refugees in the world, a terrible problem. UNHCR alone has an annual budget of $10 billion a year. That's great. It should probably be twice as much. Similarly, the fight against AIDS has a request at the UN a few months ago for $29 billion of annual investment to deal with the 36 million people who are dealing with HIV and AIDS. Also an appropriate number. What do we have coming from the international community to fight modern slavery? It's probably somewhere around $400 to $500 million of investment a year. We are an order of magnitude lower than what is necessary to deal with the fact that we now have 40, maybe 50 million people in the world today living in modern slavery. So we need more commitments, we need more political action, and we need more partnerships. And fundamentally, what I'm going to come to at the end is that I believe that we need a true comprehensive strategy that is going to produce breakthroughs by 2030. Because even if we are not able to end modern slavery by 2030, we must be able to say that we have made dramatic progress by that time. And we must be able to demonstrate to the world that we know what that looks like, and we know how to get it done, and that we've demonstrated that it's possible. So let me talk about the present. I'm going to highlight one piece of work that we are doing because it is part of the FAST initiative and what we have done with Liechtenstein, and that is a project called FLARE, which stands for Forced Labor Automatic Risk Estimation. This is a tool that we have created that has already won an innovation award. It is a predictive tool, meaning that it can detect forced labor at companies where it has not been detected previously. It gives company-level predictions, so it's highly specific, not just sweeping generalities about sectors or geographies. And it is based on public data, so it does not necessarily require proprietary data or special access or even participation from firms that may not want to be found. And so why are we doing this? I think this panel has amply demonstrated the fact that if all of this effort is going to work, all of this reporting, self-reporting, insight into companies is going to work, we need actual data and we need verification of that data to demonstrate what's really happening and where the risks of forced labor and human trafficking exist. So how have we done this? It is a tool that is based on machine learning. We have tested it with the India apparel sector, and what it does is it looks at public data and looks for patterns with real known cases and a broader group of cases about where forced labor exists. So it learns pattern recognition. It is not a tool that will necessarily tell you about the actual existence of forced labor. It creates red flags to demonstrate where forced labor is likely to have occurred. So far, the testing data has demonstrated about 80% accuracy. We're trying to improve that, and we are also now moving to field testing so that we can demonstrate whether the flags that the tool has produced have been are real. You know, I think we believe that this has great potential for uptake. It's something that can be used by investment firm or a bank looking at where to fund an ESG fund. It can also be looked at by companies themselves to determine where they may have risks in their own supply chain. It can be used by NGO watchdogs to add another layer of accountability and to direct where authorities may want to look at for forced labor problems. I don't have time to talk about another really interesting project, but I'll just mention it. A project called Nowhere to Hide, which came out of some research that we did funded by Liechtenstein, but is actually funded by a private foundation. And it's working on cryptocurrency de-anonymization to detect online sex trafficking. And so it's an interesting tool, but I don't have time to talk about it now because I want to talk about the future in my last couple of minutes. You know, we at the Global Fund have been thinking hard about what the future looks like, and we've really settled on kind of three big ideas. One is fundamentally about justice and the rule of law and the need for accountability and addressing impunities many talked about yesterday. An intensive new effort building on what we've done on supply chain integrity. And the third big one is on survivor empowerment, and that's what I want to mention today. All of these approaches for us are done with a systems change approach where we use innovation, rigorous monitoring, evaluation, and learning, and a focus on cross-cutting issues, including climate, gender, and migration. But this idea that I want to share with you, I think, builds very nicely on some of the discussion yesterday. We are developing a new initiative on survivor economic empowerment. So we were looking very closely at the great work of the Survivor Bank and the Fast Survivor Inclusion Initiative. And I want to echo some of the comments that were made yesterday that we see enormous potential for the expansion of this work by looking at new populations and new geographies. So let me give you a couple of ideas why and then what it might look like. The first is that we have seen in development more broadly in the last decade or so the incredible transformative power of financial inclusion. Not only for survivors, of course, but overall for those living in extreme poverty. It is probably the single most effective means that has driven literally millions, hundreds of millions out of extreme poverty and making those escapes from poverty sustainable. The second is that we realize that from our work with many partners around the world that there are incredibly important efforts among many of the partners here and our partners all around the world to identify, to recognize, to register, and to support survivors around the world. There's actually an incredible network of organizations and government entities that are working on finding survivors, recognizing them, and trying to get support. So there's this very large and growing body of people who could use this type of support. The third is that there's an ongoing revolution around the world in support for citizens, in rich and poor countries, strengthening social safety nets, cash transfer programs, conditional cash transfer programs, compensation for harm, which is something we touched on briefly yesterday. And then the fourth, as I mentioned, is that if you look at where is the largest pool body of survivors around the world, it is in Africa, in South Asia, in East Asia, in Latin America. These are places and people for whom financial inclusion would be tremendously transformative and very scalable. And we know that because it's been done in so many other sectors of development in the last couple of years. So what we would like to think about how to do with partnership, hopefully from some in this room, is to think about how do we put, as we say in the US, how do we put survivor financial inclusion and empowerment on steroids? How do we work with this population so that when we are meeting here in a couple of years, we're talking about tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands, potentially even by 2030 reaching 1 million people. So what would that look like? First, we need to broaden the geography of this work. And we need to go to the places where we know that there are large numbers of identified survivors. The second, which was also mentioned yesterday, is that we need to broaden the concept of survivor financial inclusion. The work that it's been done has been tremendously important, but we can really look beyond that. Look at cash transfers and digital payments that have been immensely cost-effective and scalable platforms to reach people in poverty. Look at the idea of insurance and saving accounts. Look at remittance channels, which of course we know are hugely important for the population that we're talking about. Look at access to credit. These are all things that I think can be done so that we're talking about not only making sure that people are banked, but that they have access to resources, access to credit, access to finance and the financial literacy to build themselves and their personal empowerment to take advantage of all those things. I think Tamia's story yesterday was a fantastic example of what this can look like and how this can work, and the critical importance of building that ladder and that pathway for everybody who is a survivor, who is trying to build their own sustainable pathway. And of course, we're going to need to broaden the partners working on this. The first thing that we will do, of course, is to engage heavily survivor expertise in the design of this initiative to make sure that it is informed by the experiences of the people who we wish to reach directly. The second is to bring in even more financial sector actors. I think that there are a lot of entities out there that could help with this, not only the banks, which would be critical, but other investors as well, donor investors, those working on mobile money, cash payments. I think we would need to build a big tent to do this right. And then the next step for us is that we will be seeking resources to do the research and development that's going to be necessary for a proof of concept like this, to demonstrate that we can actually carry it out in a couple of geographies successfully. I have high confidence that it's something that will work, but of course we need to prove that on the ground. And having worked on large-scale cash transfer programs before, I understand what that looks like, but it's a new sector, a new segment, a new population, and so we would want to do the due diligence necessary to carry that forward.
Thank you, Alex. Again, a lot of thought and food for thought and a lot of questions for sure from the audience, or be it the panel or myself, but in favor of time, let's go straight ahead. Lucia, you're the next one. Please go ahead.
Perfect, thanks a lot. So also from my side, a big thank you for having me here. So far I learned so much. It's been very, very interesting. Also good to know that there are many different initiatives, and I'm also confident that in the future there will be an increased focus also on human rights and social issues. So I'm from Swiss Re. For those who are not familiar with Swiss Re, it's a global reinsurance company. We provide insurance coverage to companies, but also to insurance companies, so reinsurance. And what I would like to show you here, or give you a little bit more insight, is on how we manage sustainability risks, and also how one can contribute to go to knowing and showing, well, more knowing. So sustainability has been a topic for Swiss Re since many years. So we have already developed in 2009 a sustainability risk framework, and this framework applies to all our transactions, so to the insurance side, but also to investments and sourcing activities. And it is based on 3 umbrella guidelines, so one on human rights, environment, and governance, and we also have sector-specific policies, so sectors which are most material to our business. So this is, for example, mining, thermal coal, hydropower, etc. And each of these policies is structured in the same way. So first we define which are key material risks to our business, then we define clear exclusion criteria and also best practices, which we try to leverage when we engage with clients. So I'd like to focus a little bit on the human rights umbrella guideline. So this guideline is based on the International Bill of Human Rights, the core ILO conventions, as well as the UN guiding principles. And here, for example, we define key material risk labor rights, the rights of local community, also specific groups of people, such as indigenous peoples. Another key material risk is armed conflict. And then with regards to exclusion criteria, we will not provide business support to companies or projects which are involved in forced labor, for example, or which transfer weapons to armed conflict countries. And with regards to best practices, so whenever we have an engagement with clients, we show them what we see as a best practice. So for example, if they have a fair and accessible grievance mechanism in place, that they also disclose their social performance, also try to address or identify gaps, and then also clearly communicate how they try to address these gaps. Now this is so much about the framework, but now the question is, how do we put this framework into practice? And we have a semi-automated process, so the framework is put into practice via two different tools. One is the sustainability risk assessment tool, and it's important to note that this tool is fully embedded into the underwriting process, so whenever we have a transaction, it goes through this tool. So basically all our transactions are screened for sustainability risks. And this tool is based on 4 different input factors. So one is country, then the industry, company, and project. And based on this information, the assessment, so the tool gives 4 different sensitivity levels done in an automatic way. So the first one is a low sensitivity, which means there is no sustainability risk. This could be, for example, a food factory in Liechtenstein. And the second potential outcome is medium sensitivity. So here the underwriter is required to conduct some due diligence on the transaction, and the assessment provides guidance what he needs to look into. So for example, a hydropower project in Colombia. So here the underwriter needs to check if there are any violations of local communities, if they have been evicted in a forcibly. And then another outcome is a high sensitivity. So here is the red flag that you also mentioned before. This could be, for example, a cotton transaction in Uzbekistan. And the last outcome is an abstain. So here the underwriter is already required to decline the transaction without further looking into it. This can be triggered through the company, so the company is already on our watch list. We know that the company is involved in forced labor, for example. Or it can also be triggered through a highly sensitive industry-country combination, where the human rights situation is so poor that we need positive proof that there is no human rights violation. So, for example, mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So coming back to this high sensitivity, that the red flag, the second risk tool comes into play, and this is the ESG referral tool. So the transaction is referred to my team, so Group Sustainability Risk Management, and we then look closer at the transaction. And we can issue 3 different recommendations. So either proceed, we haven't found any sustainability risk, and then we can also calibrate the tool. If we see that the company has a good sustainability performance, we can change the assessment to a medium or even to a low if it really has a good rating. The second potential outcome or recommendation we can give is a proceed with conditions. So here we make our coverage conditional. And the good thing is that most transactions are renewed after 1 year. So the coverage is only valid for 1 year, and then they have to come back to the underwriter, submit a new transaction. And this helps us to really make the condition that, for example, we want to see a clear improvement of the issues that we have found until next year. Or until next year, we want to have a social or human rights impact assessment of a specific project. And yes, and then we can decide 1 year later if these requirements were fulfilled, and based on the outcome, on what we receive, we can say, okay, it's good, you can proceed now. And the last recommendation is an abstain. So here we really see no room for improvement because there are really severe and systematic human rights violations. All these recommendations are binding, so the underwriter needs to follow our advice. He can or she can escalate the case, and then it goes a level up higher in the company till our chief risk officer is involved, or even higher, but luckily this doesn't happen that often. And I also see a clear trend that within the last year, so I joined Swiss Re 3 years ago, and there wasn't that much attention yet on sustainability. Now everyone talks about it, which makes our work also much more easy, because underwriters understand now why we are declining transactions. But not only internally, also externally, I see now a clear trend. Also more insurance companies are reaching out to us. They want to know about our approach. And I think this is really showing that the topic has gotten more attention. But I also see a clear trend line that there is more attention on environment or climate and not so much on human rights. So what I wish going forward is that we could generate the same movement as we have generated for thermal coal. So 2 years ago, many insurance companies stepped out or made a clear commitment that they don't want to insure any longer thermal coal. And the remaining insurance companies, they could really increase the premiums, so making the business economically unviable for these thermal coal companies. And going forward, I hope there could be a same movement. Here again, I also like to stress the data, so to make the process much more efficient, we need data, robust data. And as also mentioned before by Christian, unfortunately, we cannot disclose client data, so we are not saying which company we are not insuring. So I really hope that one day there, or maybe that's also something for the FAST initiative, that there will be a list of companies which are known for forced labor or modern slavery or any other human rights violation, and then together the financial industry can commit to not provide support to these companies. That's all.
Well, thank you, for your insights. Let's go ahead to Luis Fabiano. He's waiting for a long time. Luis, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. It's 5 a.m. here in Brazil. I'm happy to participate and learn from you all. I'm a Brazilian federal prosecutor and a visiting scholar at Stanford University. I'm going to talk a little bit about the actions we're taking in Brazil through the Smart Lab initiative with respect to the topic of this session. I mean, to know and to show human trafficking risks and even to think about using leverage creatively. I mean, we need evidence, we need human trafficking data, right? So in Brazil, since 1995, task forces targeting diverse sectors have rescued more than 50,000 survivors of labor trafficking and rescued 5,000 children from sex trafficking along Brazilian federal highways alone. So I'm just talking about Brazilian federal highways. And one of the institutions in Brazil tasked with fighting trafficking is the Federal Prosecution Office, where I am a prosecutor for over 16 years now. And my office is a nonpartisan, it's important policy watchdog tasked with promoting prosecution, enforcing anti-trafficking law, and coordinating Brazil's anti-trafficking policy. And to do so, of course, we need evidence, we need data. But what we call human trafficking data has not historically been perceived as available, which causes the stakeholders to struggle to implement effective policies, including in the financial sectors. Another challenge is that human trafficking data is usually understood with an excessive focus on traditional data sources such as crime statistics, number of prosecutions, number of reported cases, and so on. There is also non-traditional data sources that could be used to improve anti-trafficking policies broadly and expand the means by which we map human trafficking risks. So as soon as we realized there were these data opportunities, we started to develop what we call the Smart Lab initiative, which is a big data platform in which publicly available data is collected and organized and cleaned, and basically to provide information for academics, for ourselves in the prosecution service, for law enforcement broadly, for policymakers and other stakeholders. And it turns out the wealth of scarcely used data have been collected into this sort of repository with disaggregated time series information regarding human trafficking detection. I'm not talking about prevalence, but rather about detection. In addition, we have information about social protection programs. In Brazil, for example, we have Bolsa Família, which is the largest cash transfer program in the world, access to credit, social assistance, censuses, services, surveys, firm ownership data, etc. And by building on these data resources, we're, for example, working to expand the concept of what we call the Brazilian anti-trafficking dirty list. Since 2004, the dirty list enables the public naming and shaming of companies or individuals involved in modern slavery. So if an individual or an entity is on the list, among other penalties, they can have their assets frozen, they can be denied government subsidies, etc. So there's also a regulation that prohibits banks from granting rural credit to companies and individuals on the list. And to ensure compliance, the records from the list must be cross-referenced by financial institutions during profile checks as part of the decision-making process of whether or not to grant credit or other financial services. However, some of our investigations found signals that some financial institutions had been failing to follow these procedures. And so basically we decided to file a lawsuit against the Central Bank of Brazil, demanding immediate identification of all financial institutions in violation of the law. The first court ruling that we managed to obtain ruled that all the data concerning credit transactions involving names on the list should be turned should be turned over to prosecutors. Following that, data analysis of the transactions confirmed that at least 10 financial institutions were supplying credit to individuals and entities whose names were on the dirty list, which in turn led to further lawsuits and investigations. And by using the data we had collected, one of the things we've learned from this case is that we needed to sort of expand the dirty list accountability scheme to focus on ownership structures, because entities which don't have means of getting credit because their names are on the list, some of them use subsidiaries and parent companies to get the credit regardless of the restriction, and assuming that the corporate veil won't be lifted. Also building on the data platform, and can I share my screen quickly here? It's going to be, can you see my screen? Just to confirm. Trying to, okay, building on the data platform, we're starting the Smart Lab data platform that I mentioned. We're sort of transforming a wealth of data into easy to understand reports and data-driven resources that can be used to inform decision-making broadly. This is the Observatory for the Eradication of Slave Labor and Human Trafficking that illustrates our approach. Basically using data on trafficking detection in every municipality in Brazil, detection and risks broadly. The observatory presents dynamic maps with georeference data on trafficking and trafficking detection, and it reveals sort of geographic distribution and hotspots. So multiple social, economic, and demographic indicators at the municipality level, such as the evolution of human development indicators, poverty, social programs, and I mean, we can find those indicators for each one of the 5,570 municipalities in Brazil. And importantly, in terms of impact, based on the insights provided by Smart Lab and the recommendations we issued to the governments, some of the states in Brazil, such as the state of Maranhão, which is the huge, on the upper right area of the screen, there's this map with the red dots, and there's this huge concentration of red dots there. It's the state of Maranhão. It's a region in northern Brazil and the birthplace of more than 20% of rescued survivors. So the governor there entered into a settlement agreement with our office to design an evidence-based policy on trafficking prevention. I mean, it's a good start. Moreover, based on the observatory data, the Ministry of Human Rights is increasingly using the observatory to make data-driven decisions concerning anti-trafficking, resource allocation, and actions at the federal, state, and municipality level. So in 2021, a number of municipalities received alerts concerning the high incidence of trafficking in their territory, as a sort of a call to action. And in the same context, other opportunities emerged that nudge policymakers towards a better policymaking. And I would mention a good example related to the financial sector, which is, I mean, one of the things that we're developing now is a data sharing ecosystem where the Central Bank of Brazil, within its new ESG and due diligence policy, will use SmartLab data during the profile checks to improve the decision making and even the self-regulation of financial institutions, both in the case of credit restrictions that I mentioned, and I mean risk assessment broadly, using, like, for example, geographic variables, the information indicators regarding the municipality and the geographic location where, for example, the operations of a legal entity, a firm, a company happens. You know, that might lead, for example, to higher interest rates. So basically, in a nutshell, these are some of the examples of the things that we're doing in Brazil. Some of these things are related to, so on the bottom left, to wrap up, on the bottom left, you're going to see the map of the Amazon. You can see that on those red dots there, they're highly concentrated in they're highly correlated with the yellow areas on the map, where the deforestation happened over the past decades. And if we, you know, plot this map over time, we're going to see, like, the time series that we're going to realize that the bubbles, the dots, the red dots are moving inland as the deforestation evolves. On the top left, we have a lot of data regarding sex trafficking. On the top right, trends over time per municipality, per sector, also information about migration flows, and lots of relevant information for, you know, for us to make decisions and nudge other decision makers to do better informed decisions as well. Thanks very much. I'm happy to address any questions you may have.
Thank you, Luis Fabiano. Are there any questions from the audience to Luis Fabiano at this point? Seems not to be the case. Well, thank you to all of you. I learned really a lot, and I can only underpin what Lucia has said in the beginning. It was amazing. So many insights from so many specialists. Thank you so much. So I tried to note down, let's say, the key takeaways from my side. What I noted first was connecting the dots. There is a lot going on all over the place. And I think you mentioned we need new partnerships. And we have two amazing companies here at the table with Swiss Re and UBS. So why not learning from each other and learning from the best, and in that sense, connecting the dots. So that was my first learning for today. Then, Christian, you mentioned we should use our language a bit more precisely when it comes to the fight against modern slavery and human trafficking. That was the second one, the second learning. The third was, and came as well from your side, Christian, why not using the approach of the TCFD and take it as a role model and then translate it to the sphere of human trafficking, modern slavery. Then my fourth learning was, and I think that was that you mentioned, Alex, we need to have a clear strategy to end modern slavery and human trafficking. There the question is, who could be, let's say, or who could issue such a strategy, an overall strategy for all of us? All of us? Or let's say, is there a role to play for the fast secretariat as well? And then you mentioned, Lucia, why not having a kind of a list of companies which violate human rights? That would be, or end up in a kind of a blacklist. And then 6, we need data, and that came from more or less every panelist. We need more data, not just quantitative data, as well qualitative data. And why not mapping all the data which are available publicly and make these kind of data accessible for all of us? So these were my 6 learnings from the panel discussion. If I would ask you, let's say, to issue or address, and that's a question for all the panelists, a kind of a wish list for Daniel, what would be on the top of your wish list? Maybe, I don't know, starting, Christian, do you want to start? I know it's a difficult question, a difficult one.
I think I would still reiterate the point that we need to have a clearer understanding and agreement on what do we mean when we use certain terms. Yeah. And I think that's where the analogy to climate just doesn't work, because I think, and this is particularly important for the internal audience in the institutions that we're talking about. I mean, people need to have precision so that they know what they're supposed to be focused on. That would be my one.
Okay, thank you. Maybe Alex?
Yeah, I would say let's work together aggressively to scale up survivor financial empowerment and inclusion.
Okay.
For me, as already mentioned, it's data, and as also mentioned by you, connecting the data that is already available. Yeah.
Okay. Fiona and Serena, I hope you're still on the line. Maybe what's your point on the wish list? What's your top priority on the wish list? Yeah, Serena.
Oh, okay, Serena.
Please go ahead.
Sure, thank you. You know, I think the data is really important, but I think thinking about FAST and FAST's position with this holistic view of the financial sector, I would say we focused a lot on how do you combat the risk? How do you make supply chain slavery free? And what's the financial sector's role in that? I think for this second phase, I'd like us to think more about the opportunity. And what does that mean for the financial sector? You know, Alex spoke a lot about the opportunity for financial inclusion, whether that's banking products, insurance products, transfer payments. What does that opportunity look like for the financial sector? And how do we start working together on those kind of commercial initiatives as well and make them sustainable? So I think that would be my one big ask. And keep, along with keep doing what you're doing, because I think FAST is doing an incredible job at bringing us all together and getting us to collaborate across, you know, many different industries and sectors to create impact in the space.
Amazing, thank you. Fiona, please.
Yes, so I think what FAST needs to be doing in its next iteration of the work that it's doing is to ensure that as social data is being worked on in many different pockets around the world with regulators, etc., within institutions like my own, but with many others, that what are the indicators that you require for modern slavery and human trafficking so that it is included in everything are worked into those social indicators. I think that is important also within the investor reporting that we will do within the PRI, that there are questions around what specifically, not just on human rights at a high level, but on modern slavery and human trafficking. And then with the social taxonomies that are being developed and the human rights due diligence that have been developed with different countries around the world and the different taxonomies, that it's not left to chance, that FAST is engaged in those processes to ensure that, again, that the right questions specifically about modern slavery and human rights are being asked. There's a lot happening in this space, and now is the opportunity to make sure these are all integrated and come together, and you need to have a strong coordinating voice, making sure that that's happening.
Thank you. So more coordination. Thank you. Luis Fabiano, last but not least, I didn't want to forget you.
Sure, thanks very much.
Maybe the
Yeah,
priority on
I
your
think it.
wish list.
Come again, sorry?
The top priority on your wish list, please.
Yeah, I think it's not only, of course, it's not only about data. It's more about developing knowledge management strategy about trafficking, which might connect the data, connect the dots and produce information and transform it into actionable insights. And by actionable insights, I mean insights that might be used by different stakeholders to make better decisions to prevent trafficking. Yesterday, I heard something from one of the panelists that struck me like, something really powerful. It was something like, if we want to know, we get to know. So this struck me as like a summary of what we got to do in terms of developing data strategies and knowledge, more importantly, a knowledge management strategy that connects different, stakeholders, and through partnerships, we can achieve better results than the results that we managed to achieve so far, which are pretty limited when it comes to considering the agenda, the 2030 agenda. Thanks very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Luis Fabiano. And with that, I think I hand over to Daniel. Back to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Simon and panelists. And I think this really earns a round of applause for all of you. Thank you very much. My list of ideas and follow-up activities is getting longer and longer, but that's what we were hoping for. So thanks for not only sharing your knowledge and your experience and showcasing how we work together over the last 2 years, but also coming up with ideas for the future. We have a dedicated panel on Outlook, which will even look forward more strongly than we have already done so. But I think we all deserve a short break.